your needs or the need for new transmission, we're going to be making a mistake.
To what extent do you think permitting and the difficulties to get a permit for a new transmission line will actually answer that whole question?
Well, that's a piece of it. The other piece of this is to have an open access open transmission planning process. So part of the difficulty, and this is, you can't solve one issue in this industry without raising another problem. Right now, one of the issues that the FERC is dealing with, and they've just issued a new rulemaking, and this is on the planning process. Today, and some people may smile in this room, but there's a debate going on, very active debate, particularly in California, about who has the right of, if there's a right of first refusal around transmission. And is everyone here familiar with that issue? Let me explain it. So today, traditionally, of course, utilities would get together, transmission owners, and they would develop these transmission plans. And then they divided up the world, as sort of like Europe dividing up after World War I or World War II. They would divide up the world based on their traditional locations and decide who builds where. What's happened as we've moved to markets and independent grid operators like the California Independent System Operator or PJM, you have third parties who are developing the plans. We also have merchant transmission owners, or like these battery folks, who are coming in and saying, wait, I have an alternative that's better than what the utilities come up with, I want to build it. Now the debate that's going on is do utilities have a right of first refusal when somebody comes up with a project to say, oh, that was a better idea, okay, thank you very much, I'll build that one, because of course, from the investment community, they're putting hundreds of thousands of dollars in the development of these concepts. The transmission process is designed to be a very open process so that everybody sees what everyone else is doing. But if the utilities get to cherry pick the best process, then what is an investor, why would an investor ever invest into an independent project? They would say, wait a minute, you're just sharing your IP.
What's the basis for the utilities saying they have the first right of refusal? Was there a law or a FERC or tariff, or why do they have the right of first refusal?
Do you recall the movie, the show, Fiddler on the Roof? Tradition. There is no right.
But is it because they have a responsibility to deliver reliable power to their end users? Is that where the basis of the right of first?
Not really. I mean, there is, and utilities will argue that, yeah. And this is where I put on my lawyer hat. There is a traditional in industry, an monopolistic industry. There's a trade-off. As utilities were authorized to provide, they have a certain rate of return, where they have a government set rate, but they're allowed to earn their return. Versus, and in the sort of the devil exchange they made with that, the exchange with the devil is an obligation to serve. And so from a utility basis, particularly at the distribution level, utilities have an obligation to serve everybody who comes onto their system, unlike a store or anyone else, or we could say, look, if you don't have the right credit, I'm not going to serve you. Utilities have no right to do that. But in exchange for that, they have a right of return, and in exchange for that, there's a certain monopolistic right. The other piece of this is that everyone recognized, and that's why utilities in the 1970s became regulated in the 60s, is that we didn't want multiple wires going down streets about who was racing to hook up the house. So utilities also had defined service areas so that the state set these up so that you didn't have different utilities as we went through the electrification trying to fight who serves which customer, right? So it's a franchise right. At the transmission level, there is no franchise right. It was just the way the utilities developed their system. So now that we have third parties that are basically developing the plans, there's a question as to whether or not a utility should has a particular right to say where I have no load here. It's just that this is the geographic region I've always built my transmission system in. The issue becomes even more complicated outside of states like California, which are one RTO states, to states like that PJM serves, where there's 13 states, or MISO, where there are 15 states, and you're going across state lines. Well, who owns that space? And so the debate that's going on at FERC right now is if it creates number one, a chill on interstate commerce, number two, it prevents investment in merchant transmission, and number three, is not essential to get it built, because it used to be if you had embedded within the right to build transmission was the fact that you have the eminent domain right, because you were providing a public service, and so that therefore you had as a utility, almost a quasi-public entity, the right to take land from private parties because you were providing an essential public service. That issue has also become very complicated again when you're looking at interstate lines that are designed to serve markets, not necessarily a particular customer. So should I take property in Pennsylvania to serve New Jersey? There's no eminent domain right there. So as a result, this whole issue is become where the law has not really followed the progress, and people are debating as right of first refusal on what basis. So that's pending at FERC right now, and FERC is walking a fine line, because at the same time, in our very complex system of regulating utilities, states and local authorities have siting rights, not FERC. FERC has this large siting right of corridors. And so if the states don't like what the FERC is doing, they'll say, fine, FERC, you can give someone that right, but that line will never get sited unless our local utility does it, because at least we can control them. I had a question up front.
But one of the major issues on that business of somebody else comes into the utility business and somehow works there, it is nice if they can be forced to do the hard jobs, right? So if I have a small job where I can milk the local system and somehow get a lot of money, okay, but then I don't do the tough job where I have to cut 2 trees and have cross rivers and whatnot. If we start picking up who takes the jobs, then the utilities become like taking the worst jobs, while the private sector or the non-utility takes the good jobs, and there would be kind of an imbalance. Is not that one of the problems? I mean, my English is not so correct, but...
Your English is great. The question is wrong. No, I don't think so. I'll tell you why. We have to rebuild our system, right? We have so much work to rebuild our system. I mean, most of the transmission system, we did a study in PJM. More than 50% of the assets in PJM were 30 years of old, and there were 30% of the assets that were beyond their useful life. And so there's so much work for the utilities to do, and we haven't built transmission in this country in the last 15 years that we needed to. So I think that the utilities' concern, am I going to run out of investment opportunity? I think that there's not. The problem is the question of siting. I mean, if we have, for example, and I'll use an example, Path 15, some of the more interesting projects, was a private-public partnership. It was merchant transmission that got it done. If someone hadn't stepped forward and do it, and those are projects that's difficult for utilities to do because they're multiple state projects, and so they really do need to get them done. I think that if you were talking about, for example, someone has to do an upgrade on a 169 to a 345, clearly that should be the utility runs the 169. It would be silly to introduce a third party and almost impossible to figure out how to negotiate it. But if somebody is coming up with a very innovative project, such as putting batteries at locations, to say, I'm going to, someone's developed it, they've studied it, they have identified the best location, they've gotten the funding, they've gone through the planning process, and the RTO or the ISO has blessed it and said, yes, that solves a huge problem for us. And at that point, the utility steps in and says, okay, good. You've done all the legwork, now I'm going to take the project, and I won't pay you for it because I have the right of first refusal. That will just chill innovation. So you're right, there's a balance, but I think we're so far from worrying about whether utilities will have enough room to grow. There's so much they need to do that I just don't think it's an issue. The other thing is, all those times, it's sort of reminiscent to me of every time there's an innovation or change in this industry. It's the first time thing that people say, well, what about the poor utilities? They won't get a chance. And I think about that like in the independent power producers industry. When we first started building independent power plants, everyone used to say, oh my gosh, those guys won't run those plants reliably. They're not like utilities. They don't understand we have a right to serve. Well, if you go through the nation's power plants and look at the capacity factors, the availability factors, the merchant plants have much higher availability factors than traditional utilities, simply because that's the only way they make money. If they don't do a good job, they're out of business. If a utility doesn't do a good job, oh, I messed up that one, but they move on. So I think that there's plenty of room at the table. I think the pie is big enough, but I also don't think that we're far from worrying. And also the third piece is that there are projects that utilities really can't do because they're multi-state projects that would be hard for them to pull off, unless they do it in partnership, like, for example, American Electric Power in Mid-America has done, but they've really created a third company that is an independent transmission company, and they've just done it under a utility umbrella. Thank you.
Do you think there's any chance that there'll be a federal legislation to create a sort of master transmission planning functionality? Because it seems like, this is never going to get there if we do it in a very piecemeal.
Oh, there is. There is legislation that's passed. And in fact, DOE has done some funding to look at regional transmission planning. And part of this proposed rulemaking that the FERC just came out of is around the standards to look at regional transmission planning. So there's three things that are confounding, things that are confounding transmission development. Maybe more once I go through it. But one is the siting issue. That's something FERC really can't handle because it's a state issue, except for these national corridors. So that's something that Congress is going to have to figure out how to step in on to get it done. The second is price. And when you're talking about major transmission, I thought we were going to talk about storage, but if you're talking about major transmission investment, one of the things that happens is the cost allocation. So, for example, on a line like where you're building a 500 kV or a 345 kV line that serves multiple loads, who pays for it? Is it, because the traditional way is that the utility ratepayers who own the line paid for the line. But if you're building it to serve multiple customers, how do you allocate the cost? So FERC is, in this proposed rulemaking, has done what's called a highway-byway rate, where effectively they've, and it's based on load flow studies that have identified above a certain kilowatt transfer capability, all the electrons that go on get spread out throughout the region that the line is located on, so it acts like the interstate highway, and everybody should contribute. And then below a certain level, it's very localized, and the utility that it's located in would contribute. So, but that's a very controversial issue because now FERC is essentially identifying which retail ratepayers pay for what. And that's where our very hierarchical system is bogging down. And then the third is this right of first refusal. Who gets to build, who gets to own? So we've got to, and so what FERC has identified is they're going to do a regional planning process where everybody within the region will be part of these regional, and in the West it could be, and this is another debate, WECC versus California ISO. Who will do it in the West? In the other regions of the country, it's a little easier, except for the Southeast where nobody, there isn't an entity yet. So those are people are on it to resolve it, but then within the resolution, it's who gets to build, how do we pay for it, and FERC has basically told the utilities, look, you can threaten, but everybody in the country is going to be under the same set of rules. So we just got to get with it and get it done.